The morning sun painted the Arizona mountains in shades of amber and gold as Thomas Mackenzie gripped the steering wheel of his battered Ford pickup truck. At 73 years old, his weathered hands told the story of 5 decades working the unforgiving desert ranch that his father had carved from seemingly worthless land. Each callus, each scar, each age spot mapped a lifetime of struggle against nature, economics, and his own stubborn pride. The pain in his chest had started 3 days earlier, while he was mending fence posts along the eastern boundary of his property. It began as a dull ache that he dismissed as pulled muscle from lifting too much weight. Thomas Mackenzie was not a man who complained about physical discomfort. He had broken his arm twice, suffered through pneumonia without seeing a doctor, and once removed a bullet from his own leg after a hunting accident. Pain was simply another aspect of ranch life, like drought, coyotes, and unpredictable cattle prices. But this morning was different. The pain had spread from his chest down his left arm, and each breath felt like someone was slowly tightening a rope around his ribcage. Still, he had loaded the truck with supplies for town, just as he did every Tuesday morning for the past 40 years. The routine was sacred to him, a connection to normalcy in a world that seemed to change too fast for his comfort. His ranch, the Double M, stretched across 12,000 acres of what most people would consider wasteland. Scrub brush, cacti, and hardy desert grass provided meager grazing for his cattle. Water was always scarce, requiring constant maintenance of wells and careful management of every precious drop. Most neighboring ranchers had sold their land to developers or mining companies over the years, but Thomas refused every offer. This land was his legacy, bought with his father's blood and sweat during the Great Depression. The irony was not lost on him that his nearest neighbors were members of the Tohono-O'odham Nation, whose ancestors had lived on this desert long before any white man dreamed of raising cattle here. The relationship between the ranchers and the tribal community had been complicated for generations. There was no open hostility, but there was no friendship either. They existed in parallel worlds that occasionally intersected at the general store in town or during county meetings, but rarely ventured beyond polite formality. Thomas had inherited his father's attitudes along with the ranch. Marcus Mackenzie had taught his son that Indians were lazy, unreliable, and prone to drinking away any money they earned. These beliefs had been reinforced by decades of gossip, isolated incidents blown out of proportion, and the comfortable distance that prejudice provides. Thomas never questioned these assumptions because he never had reason to. His life was contained within the boundaries of his ranch, the weekly trips to town, and the small circle of neighboring ranchers who shared his worldview. As he drove toward town that Tuesday morning, the pain intensified with each mile. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early hour, and his vision occasionally blurred at the edges. The rational part of his mind knew he should drive straight to the hospital in Tucson, but Thomas Mackenzie had never been accused of being overly rational when it came to his own well-being. He had supplies to buy, bills to pay, and a routine to maintain. The truck radio crackled with news from the outside world: Korea, politics, and economic reports that had little bearing on his daily existence. He preferred the silence of the desert to the noise of civilization, but the radio provided company during the long drives to town. This morning, however, even the familiar voices of the news anchors seemed distant and unimportant compared to the increasing urgency of the pain in his chest. 20 miles from town, the pain became unbearable. Thomas pulled over to the side of the dirt road, gasping for breath and clutching his chest. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like ancient sentinels in the morning light. He sat in the truck for several minutes, hoping the pain would subside, but instead it continued to build like a storm gathering strength. In the back of his mind, he knew what was happening. His father had died of a heart attack at 68, collapsing in the middle of branding cattle. Thomas had always assumed he would go the same way, but he had imagined it happening on his own land, among his own cattle, not stranded on a dusty road between nowhere and somewhere. The medicine bottle in his shirt pocket had been prescribed after his last visit to the doctor 6 months earlier. Dr. Harrison had warned him about his blood pressure, his cholesterol, and his stubborn refusal to take better care of himself. The nitroglycerin tablets were supposed to help with chest pain, but Thomas had never needed to use them. He had carried the bottle more to appease the doctor than from any real belief that he would need emergency medication. Now, with trembling fingers, he fumbled with the small plastic bottle. The childproof cap seemed impossibly complicated as his coordination deteriorated. Finally, he managed to open it and shook out 2 small white tablets. The doctor had explained that these should be placed under his tongue during an episode of chest pain. Thomas followed the instructions, hoping for immediate relief that never came. The heat was building as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Even with the truck windows down, the temperature inside the cab was becoming uncomfortable. Thomas knew he needed help, but his pride warred with his practical needs. He had never asked for help from anyone, had built his entire life around self-reliance and independence. The idea of flagging down a passing vehicle and admitting weakness was almost as painful as the heart attack itself. An hour passed with no traffic on the remote road. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, each episode leaving him weaker than before. During his lucid moments, he found himself thinking about his life with surprising clarity. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, who had died of cancer 15 years earlier. He thought about the children they never had, the conversations they never finished, and the words of love he never spoke often enough. He thought about his father's advice on the day he took over the ranch. "This land will test you every day," Marcus had said. "It will try to break you with drought, flood, disease, and loneliness. But if you can endure, if you can prove yourself worthy, it will provide for you and protect you until the day you die." Thomas had proven himself worthy 1,000 times over, but now the desert seemed indifferent to his suffering. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke through his deteriorating consciousness. Through the dusty windshield, he could see an old Chevrolet truck approaching from the direction of the reservation. As it came closer, he could make out 2 figures in the front seat. His first instinct was relief that help had arrived. His second thought was the uncomfortable realization that his rescuers would likely be Native Americans. The truck pulled over behind his Ford, and Thomas heard car doors slamming. Footsteps approached on the gravel, and soon a woman's voice was calling out in accented English. "Mister, are you okay? Do you need help?" Thomas tried to respond, but only managed a weak grunt. The woman appeared at his driver's side window, and he found himself looking into the worried face of someone who could have been his daughter's age if he had ever had a daughter. She was Native American, with long black hair tied back practically, and clothes that spoke of hard work and modest means. "My name is Elena Moreno," she said quickly. "This is my daughter, Rosa. We saw your truck and thought you might need help. Are you sick?" Behind her, a young girl peered around her mother's shoulder. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with large dark eyes that seemed too serious for her age. Thomas tried to speak, to explain his situation, but the words came out as gasps and incomplete sentences. Elena immediately understood the severity of the situation. "Rosa, run back to the truck and get the water jug. Hurry." She turned back to Thomas with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from experience with crisis. "Sir, I think you're having a heart attack. We need to get you to a hospital right away." The irony of the situation was not lost on Thomas, even in his deteriorated state. Here he was, possibly dying, being helped by the very people his father had taught him to distrust. Elena's competence and immediate compassion stood in stark contrast to every stereotype he had carried for 7 decades. "Can you move?" Elena asked, assessing his condition with practiced eyes. "We could drive you to the hospital faster than waiting for an ambulance out here." Thomas shook his head weakly and pointed to his shirt pocket. Elena understood immediately and retrieved the medicine bottle. She read the label quickly, then looked at the remaining tablets. "How many have you taken?" she asked. "2." Thomas managed to whisper. Elena's expression grew more concerned. She looked back toward her own truck, where Rosa was retrieving the water jug, then made a decision that would change everything that followed. "Sir, my daughter is very sick. We were driving to the clinic to get medicine for her fever, but I think your need is more urgent than ours right now." Thomas looked at the woman with new understanding. She was faced with the same impossible choice he was, the need for medical help with no immediate solution available. But, unlike him, she had someone else depending on her. The young girl, Rosa, was indeed pale and listless as she returned with the water jug. "What's wrong with her?" Thomas asked, surprised by his own concern for a stranger's child. "High fever for 3 days," Elena explained while helping him sip water. "The clinic doctor gave us special medicine last month when she had pneumonia, but we used it all. She needs more, but they won't have any until next week." Thomas felt a strange clarity cut through the pain and confusion. In his shirt pocket, along with the heart medication, was a bottle of antibiotics that Dr. Harrison had prescribed for his own chest infection 2 months earlier. He had taken half the prescription and saved the rest, as was his habit with all medications. The pills were exactly what the child needed, and Thomas suddenly understood that he was being presented with a choice that would define the last chapter of his life. Elena continued to minister to him with gentle efficiency, checking his pulse, monitoring his breathing, and talking to him in a calm voice to keep him conscious. Rosa stood quietly beside the truck, clearly unwell, but trying to be helpful. The contrast between his situation and theirs was stark. He was old, had lived a full life, and had no family depending on him. She was young, with decades ahead of her, and a mother who would be devastated by her loss. The medicine bottle felt heavy in his pocket as Thomas considered his options. He could keep the antibiotics for his own potential future need, or he could give them to a child who needed them immediately. The decision should have been simple, but 7 decades of ingrained prejudice whispered arguments in his ear. These people were strangers. They were different. He owed them nothing. But stronger than the voice of prejudice was the voice of conscience, perhaps awakened by his proximity to death. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him of the man she had married, the man who had once driven 50 miles through a blizzard to help a neighbor he barely liked. Somewhere along the way, fear and loneliness had hardened his heart, but it wasn't too late to remember who he really was. With great effort, Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the second medicine bottle. He pressed it into Elena's surprised hand, his voice barely a whisper, but his words clear. "For your daughter. Antibiotics. She needs them more than I do." Elena stared at the bottle in amazement, then looked back at Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Are you sure? Don't you need these?" Thomas managed a weak smile. "I'm an old man. She's got her whole life ahead of her. Take care of her." The last thing Thomas Mackenzie saw before losing consciousness was the look of profound gratitude on Elena's face, and the small hand of her daughter reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture of thanks. In that moment, the barriers of race, culture, and generation dissolved, leaving only the fundamental human connection that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Elena Moreno stood beside the unconscious rancher's truck, holding the bottle of antibiotics with shaking hands. The magnitude of what had just happened overwhelmed her practical mind. A complete stranger, a man from a community that had never shown kindness to her people, had just given her daughter life-saving medicine with his potentially dying breath. The weight of such generosity felt almost impossible to bear. Rosa leaned against her mother's leg, her fever-flushed face showing confusion about the situation unfolding around her. At 10 years old, she understood that the old white man was very sick and that somehow her mother had acquired the medicine she desperately needed. What she couldn't understand was why this stranger would help them when most white people in the area seemed to look right through Native Americans as if they didn't exist. "Mama, is he going to die?" Rosa asked quietly, looking at Thomas's still form slumped in the driver's seat. Elena checked his pulse again, relieved to find it still beating, though weakly and irregularly. "I don't know, Mija, but we need to get him help quickly." She looked around at the empty desert landscape, then back at her own truck. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away in Tucson, but the clinic on the reservation was only 15 miles in the opposite direction. The decision was complicated by more than just distance. The tribal clinic was small, understaffed, and not equipped to handle serious cardiac emergencies. But it was closer, and Dr. Martinez was an excellent physician who might be able to stabilize Thomas before transferring him to the city hospital. More importantly, Elena knew that every minute counted when someone was having a heart attack. "Rosa, I need you to be very brave right now," Elena said, kneeling down to her daughter's eye level. "This man saved your life by giving you his medicine. Now we need to try to save his life. Can you help me?" The little girl nodded solemnly, her fever making her movements slow, but her determination clear. Elena quickly assessed the situation. Thomas was unconscious but breathing. His truck was in working condition, and she was a competent driver. Moving him to her smaller truck would waste precious time and might worsen his condition. The logical solution was for her to drive his truck while Rosa followed in their Chevrolet. "But, Mama, I don't know how to drive," Rosa protested when Elena explained the plan. "I know, sweetheart, but you've watched me drive hundreds of times, and it's only 15 miles on a straight road. You can do this." Elena spoke with more confidence than she felt, knowing that the alternative was leaving Thomas to die while she drove Rosa to the clinic alone. Elena helped Rosa into the driver's seat of the Chevrolet, adjusting the seat and showing her how to reach the pedals. "Remember, just like when you helped me steer from my lap. Gas pedal on the right, brake on the left. Stay behind me, and if you get scared or confused, just stop the truck and wait for me." Rosa's eyes were wide with fear and responsibility, but she nodded her understanding. Elena kissed her daughter's forehead, noting that the fever was still high. "The medicine will help you feel better soon, but I need you to be strong just a little longer." Elena climbed into Thomas's truck, immediately struck by how different it was from her own vehicle. Everything was bigger, heavier, and more powerful. The seat was positioned for someone much taller, and she had to strain to reach the pedals properly. But the engine started smoothly, and she could see Rosa in the rearview mirror gripping the steering wheel of the Chevrolet with intense concentration. The convoy began its slow journey toward the reservation, Elena maintaining a careful speed that Rosa could match safely. In her peripheral vision, she could see Thomas's condition deteriorating. His breathing was becoming more labored, and his color was turning an alarming shade of gray. She pressed the gas pedal slightly harder, balancing speed against Rosa's inexperience behind the wheel. The landscape they traveled through told the story of the complex relationship between the white ranchers and the Native American community. Elena's route took them past the boundaries of several large ranches, properties that had once been part of the traditional Tohono-O'odham territory. Her grandfather had told stories of hunting deer and gathering saguaro fruit on lands that were now fenced and posted with no trespassing signs. But Elena had learned to view this history without bitterness. Her parents had taught her that anger was a poison that hurt the one who carried it more than those it was directed toward. Instead, she had focused on building a life for herself and Rosa that honored their heritage while adapting to modern realities. She worked as a nurse's aide at the reservation clinic, a job that provided modest but steady income and allowed her to help her community. Rosa's father had been killed in a mining accident when the girl was only 5 years old. The company had paid a small settlement that Elena used to buy their modest home and to ensure Rosa could attend school regularly. As a single mother, Elena faced challenges that were both universal and specific to her situation as a Native American woman in 1952 Arizona. Job opportunities were limited, health care was inadequate, and educational resources were scarce. Despite these obstacles, Elena was determined that Rosa would have opportunities she had never enjoyed. The child was bright, curious, and already reading at a level well beyond her years. Elena dreamed of Rosa attending college, becoming a teacher or a nurse, maybe even a doctor. But Those dreams required Rosa to survive childhood diseases in a place where modern medicine was often unavailable. The bottle of antibiotics that Thomas had given her represented more than just immediate medical relief. It represented hope, generosity between communities that had been divided for too long, and the possibility that old prejudices could be overcome through acts of simple human kindness. As they approached the reservation boundary, Elena could see Rosa beginning to struggle with the demands of driving. The little girl's fever was sapping her strength, and her inexperience was showing as the truck began to weave slightly on the road. Elena slowed down even more, worried about pushing her daughter beyond her capabilities. The reservation clinic was a modest building that served a community of nearly 3,000 people. Dr. James Martinez had been the chief medical officer for 6 years, having come to the position after completing his residency in Phoenix. He was one of only 2 doctors serving the entire reservation, a workload that would have challenged physicians with far more resources and support staff. Elena pulled into the clinic parking lot with Rosa's truck following close behind. She immediately began honking the horn to attract attention, knowing that Dr. Martinez would need to be prepared for a cardiac emergency. Several people emerged from the building, including the doctor himself, who quickly assessed the situation and began issuing orders. "Elena, what happened?" Dr. Martinez asked as he checked Thomas's vital signs through the truck window. "Heart attack, doctor. He's been unconscious for 20 minutes. This man gave Rosa his antibiotics when he could have kept them for himself." Elena spoke quickly, providing the essential information while helping Rosa out of the other truck. "Dr. Martinez raised his eyebrows at this information, but didn't pause in his medical assessment. "We need to get him inside immediately. His condition is critical." He turned to 2 orderlies who had arrived with a stretcher. "Carefully, and watch his airway." As the medical team transferred Thomas into the clinic, Elena finally had a moment to attend to her own daughter. Rosa was pale and shaking, whether from fever, exhaustion from driving, or the stress of the situation. Elena opened the bottle of antibiotics and gave Rosa the first dose, along with water and gentle reassurance. "You did so good, Mija. You probably saved that man's life by helping me get him here quickly." Inside the clinic, Dr. Martinez worked with efficient urgency to stabilize Thomas's condition. The facility was not equipped for major cardiac procedures, but the doctor had experience with heart attack patients and knew how to provide immediate care while arranging transportation to more advanced facilities. "His condition is stabilizing for now," Dr. Martinez reported to Elena after 30 minutes of intensive care. "But he needs surgery, and we'll have to transfer him to Tucson as soon as possible. The ambulance should be here within the hour." Elena felt a wave of relief, mixed with continued concern. "Will he be okay? It's too early to tell for certain, but you got him here in time. A few more hours in the desert heat without treatment, and we would have been planning a funeral instead of a transfer." Dr. Martinez looked at Elena with curiosity. "You said he gave Rosa his antibiotics? That's quite unusual, especially given the relationship between the ranchers and our community." Elena nodded, still amazed by the generosity of the gesture. He could have kept them for himself, but he saw Rosa was sick and insisted we take them. "I've never experienced anything like it." Dr. Martinez considered this information while checking on Rosa, who was already showing signs of improvement from the antibiotic treatment. "You know, Elena, there are protocols we should follow. This man will need family notification, and someone should contact his ranch to let them know where he is. But more than that, I think the community should know about what happened here today." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, though she suspected she understood the doctor's implications. "Acts of genuine kindness between our communities are rare enough that they shouldn't go unnoticed. This man's gesture could serve as an example of what's possible when people see beyond their differences to our shared humanity." Elena had been thinking the same thing, but she was also aware of the potential complications. Some people might not believe it happened, or they might think we're making too much of a simple medical emergency. Perhaps Dr. Martinez agreed, but I think there are people in both communities who are ready to hear this story. And I think there's someone specific who should hear it first. Elena understood immediately. Dr. Martinez was referring to her grandfather, Joseph Moreno, who held the position of spiritual elder for their section of the reservation. At 85 years old, Joseph was revered for his wisdom, his knowledge of traditional healing practices, and his ability to bridge the gap between ancient ways and modern necessities. Grandfather doesn't usually involve himself in affairs with the white community, Elena said carefully. No, but he does involve himself in matters of spiritual significance. A dying man's gift to a child, made across cultural boundaries that have existed for generations? I think your grandfather might see this as something more than a simple medical emergency. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard outside the clinic. Elena looked through the window to see not just the expected ambulance from Tucson, but also several trucks from the reservation. Word of the unusual situation had already begun to spread through the community's informal communication network. Among those arriving was Elena's cousin Miguel, who worked as a mechanic in town and had contacts throughout both the white and Native American communities. Behind him came several other family members and community leaders, all drawn by reports of the strange events that had unfolded on the desert road. "Elena," Miguel called as he entered the clinic. "We heard what happened. Is it true that old Mackenzie gave Rosa his medicine?" The use of Thomas's name surprised Elena. "You know who he is?" "Everyone knows Mackenzie. He's owned the Double M Ranch for 40 years. Never been friendly to our people. Never been hostile either. Just kept to himself mostly." Miguel paused, processing the implications. This is very unusual behavior for him. Dr. Martinez emerged from the treatment room, where Thomas was being prepared for transport. "The patient is stable enough for transfer. The Tucson team will take over his care from here." He looked around at the gathered community members. "I think everyone should know that this man's actions today probably saved Rosa's life. He gave her antibiotics he could have kept for his own emergency." A murmur of amazement and discussion arose among the gathered people. Acts of generosity between individuals were common within the community, but gestures of kindness from white ranchers to Native Americans were virtually unprecedented in their collective experience. "Has anyone notified his family?" asked Maria Santos, an older woman who served as one of the community's informal leaders. "He doesn't have family," Miguel replied. "Never married, no children. Lives alone on that ranch, and has for years." This information added another layer of complexity to the situation. Thomas Mackenzie was not just a generous stranger. He was a lonely old man who had reached across cultural boundaries in what might have been his final moments. The gesture took on additional poignancy when viewed in the context of his isolation. As the ambulance team prepared to transport Thomas to Tucson, Elena made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "I want to ride with him to the hospital. Rose is feeling better, and Miguel can watch her. This man helped us when he could have ignored us completely. The least I can do is make sure he's not alone during his treatment." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "That's a generous gesture, Elena, and very appropriate given the circumstances." As the ambulance pulled away with Elena and Thomas inside, the group of community members stood in the clinic parking lot discussing the extraordinary events of the day. Miguel voiced what many were thinking. "We should tell Elder Moreno about this. He'll know what it means and what we should do about it." The consensus was immediate and unanimous. Joseph Moreno would need to hear this story, and soon. What none of them could predict was how profoundly the tale of a dying rancher's gift would affect not just their respected elder, but the entire spiritual and social fabric of their community. Joseph Moreno sat in the shade of an ancient mesquite tree that had been his place of contemplation for over 60 years. At 85, his weathered face mapped the history of his people's struggles and triumphs, each line telling stories of loss, survival, and adaptation. His long gray hair was braided with traditional beads that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had witnessed the last free days of the Tejano Owadam before the reservation boundaries were drawn. The morning had begun like countless others. Joseph had risen before dawn to offer prayers to the four directions, to honor the spirits of his ancestors, and to seek guidance for the challenges facing his people. But this morning felt different. Throughout his prayers, he had experienced an unusual restlessness, a sense that significant events were unfolding beyond his immediate awareness. As the spiritual elder for his community, Joseph had learned to pay attention to such feelings. His grandmother had taught him that the spirit world often communicated through subtle signs that required careful interpretation. Dreams, unusual animal behavior, changes in the wind patterns, unexpected encounters, all could carry messages for those trained to read them. Joseph's path to becoming a medicine man had been neither straight nor easy. As a young man in the 1920s, he had been sent to government schools designed to strip Native American children of their cultural identity. For 8 years, he had been forbidden to speak his native language, practice traditional ceremonies, or even acknowledge his heritage. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also strengthened his resolve to preserve the old ways for future generations. After returning to the reservation, Joseph had sought out the few remaining elders who still remembered the traditional teachings. He had spent decades learning the ancient songs, the healing ceremonies, the stories that connected his people to the land and to each other. By the time he reached middle age, he had become one of the most knowledgeable keepers of Tohono O'odham spiritual traditions. But Joseph's wisdom extended beyond traditional practices. He understood that his people lived in two worlds simultaneously, the world of their ancestors and the modern world of government agencies, hospitals, and schools. His role was to help them navigate both worlds without losing their essential identity. This required a delicate balance of preserving tradition while embracing beneficial aspects of contemporary life. The sound of approaching vehicles broke Joseph's morning meditation. Through the dust clouds kicked up by multiple trucks, he could see his grandson Miguel leading what appeared to be an urgent convoy toward his home. Such gatherings usually meant either celebration or crisis, and something in the urgency of their approach suggested the latter. Miguel was the first to reach Joseph's side, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by an expression of profound amazement. Behind him came Dr. Martinez from the clinic, several community leaders, and a dozen other people whose presence indicated that something extraordinary had occurred. "Grandfather," Miguel began, using the formal address that showed respect for Joseph's spiritual position, "we need to tell you about something that happened this morning. Something that I think has great meaning for our people." Joseph gestured for the group to sit in the circle of shade provided by the mesquite tree. This was a sacred space where important community decisions had been made for generations. The fact that Miguel had brought such a large group to this place indicated that the morning's events were more significant than simple medical emergency or family crisis. Dr. Martinez stepped forward to provide the medical details with clinical precision. "Elder Moreno, this morning Elena and Rosa were traveling to town when they found an elderly white rancher having a heart attack beside the road. The man was Thomas Mackenzie, who owns the Double M Ranch. He was dying, but before he lost consciousness, he gave Elena his antibiotics for Rosa's fever." Joseph listened without interruption, but his expression grew increasingly thoughtful as the story unfolded. When Dr. Martinez finished, several other people added details about the dramatic race to the clinic, Rosa's brave driving, and Thomas's current condition at the Tucson hospital. "Tell me about this man Mackenzie," Joseph said when the immediate story was complete. "What kind of person has he been to our community?" Miguel answered first. "He's never been friendly, grandfather, but he's never been hostile either. Just kept to himself mostly. I've done some mechanical work on his equipment over the years. He pays fairly and doesn't cause trouble, but he's not someone you'd expect to show kindness to our people." Maria Santos, who had the longest memory of anyone present, provided additional context. "His father was one of the original ranchers who came here in the 1890s. They took land that had been ours, but they didn't drive us off violently like some others did. The Mackenzies just fenced their property and left us alone. Not friendship, but not war either." Joseph absorbed this information while studying the faces of the people gathered around him. He could see that the morning's events had affected them profoundly, challenging assumptions they had carried about the relationship between their communities. But, more than that, he could sense a spiritual significance to the story that went beyond its surface meaning. "Where is Elena now?" Joseph asked. "She went with Mackenzie to the hospital in Tucson," Dr. Martinez replied. "She said she didn't want him to be alone during his treatment." This detail seemed to particularly resonate with Joseph. He closed his eyes for a long moment, appearing to enter a state of deep contemplation. The gathered people waited respectfully, understanding that their spiritual leader was seeking guidance from sources beyond normal human perception. When Joseph opened his eyes, his expression had changed. The thoughtful concern had been replaced by something approaching wonder, mixed with a sense of recognition that suggested the morning's events fitted into a larger pattern he was beginning to perceive. "My friends," Joseph said slowly, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of spiritual leadership, "what happened this morning was not a random act of kindness. It was a sign, a message from the spirits about the possibility of healing between our peoples." He stood up, his aged frame moving with surprising grace, and began to pace within the circle of shade. This was how Joseph always processed significant spiritual insights, walking the sacred space while allowing understanding to deepen. "For 70 years, I have lived with the wounds that were carved into our communities by fear, misunderstanding, and the belief that we cannot share this land in peace. I have watched good people on both sides suffer from this separation, becoming less than they could be because they could not see the humanity in those who looked different or lived differently." Joseph paused in his pacing to look directly at each person present. But today a dying man chose love over fear. He chose to give life to a child who was not his own, from a people who were not his people. And Elena chose to remain with him, to ensure that his kindness was met with kindness. These choices create sacred bonds that transcend the artificial boundaries we have accepted for too long. Maria Santos raised a question that several others were thinking. "But, Elder, what does this mean for us practically? One act of kindness doesn't change 70 years of separation." Joseph smiled, recognizing the wisdom of the question. "You are right that one act alone doesn't change everything. But sacred acts create ripples, like stones thrown into still water. What we do in response to this morning's events will determine whether those ripples grow into waves of change or disappear into forgotten history." Dr. Martinez leaned forward with interest. "What do you think we should do, Elder?" "First, we must ensure that Thomas Mackenzie recovers from his illness. Not just because we owe him this debt, but because his healing would complete the sacred circle that began with Rose's healing. Second, we must find ways to honor his gift that create opportunities for deeper understanding between our communities." Joseph's suggestion generated animated discussion among the gathered people. Some were enthusiastic about the possibility of building bridges with their white neighbors. Others worried about the practical challenges and potential rejection they might face from people who had shown little interest in friendship over the decades. Miguel voiced a concern that several others shared. "Grandfather, what if the other ranchers don't want anything to do with us? What if they see Mackenzie's action as weakness or betrayal? Then we will have learned something important about their character," Joseph replied. "But we cannot make decisions based on fear of rejection. We can only act in accordance with our values and hope that others will respond with their highest selves." As the discussion continued, Joseph felt a growing certainty that the morning's events were connected to something larger than individual personalities or community politics. Throughout his life, he had experienced moments when the spiritual and physical worlds seemed to intersect in ways that created opportunities for profound change. This felt like one of those moments. "There is something else," Joseph said, interrupting the practical discussions. "Tonight, I will perform a healing ceremony for Thomas Mackenzie. Not because our medicine can cure heart disease better than hospital doctors, but because his spirit needs to understand the sacred significance of what he has done." This announcement surprised everyone present, including Dr. Martinez, who understood both traditional and modern medical approaches. "Elder, with respect, Thomas Mackenzie is not part of our community. He may not understand or appreciate traditional healing ceremonies. Joseph nodded acknowledgement of the concern. You are right that he may not understand. But understanding is not always necessary for healing to occur. His action this morning opened a door between worlds that has been closed for too long. Whether he realizes it or not, he has taken on a spiritual burden that requires ceremonial attention. The concept of spiritual burden was familiar to everyone present. In Tohono O'odham tradition, significant actions, especially those that affected the balance between different groups of people, created spiritual obligations that needed to be formally recognized and properly channeled. What kind of ceremony do you have in mind? Asked Maria Santos, who often assisted Joseph with traditional healing practices. A gratitude ceremony, combined with prayers for healing and understanding between peoples. We will honor Mackenzie's gift, ask for his recovery, and request guidance about how to build upon what he has begun. Joseph's eyes seem to focus on something beyond the immediate group, and I believe we should invite representatives from the white community to participate. This suggestion generated the most intense discussion yet. The idea of white people participating in traditional Tohono O'odham ceremonies was unprecedented in most people's memory. Even Joseph himself had never attempted such cultural bridge building in his decades of spiritual leadership. How would we even approach them? Miguel asked. Most of the ranchers barely acknowledge our existence. They're not going to be interested in our religious practices. Joseph considered this practical challenge while continuing to pace within the sacred circle. We will start with those who are most likely to understand the significance of what has happened. Dr. Harrison, who is Mackenzie's physician, might be willing to listen. And there may be others in the white community who have been waiting for an opportunity to build better relationships, but haven't known how to begin. Dr. Martinez offered to serve as an intermediary, given his professional relationships with doctors and administrators at the Tucson hospital. I could speak with Dr. Harrison about Mackenzie's condition and gradually introduce the idea of our ceremony. If I frame it in terms of community healing and cross-cultural understanding, he might be receptive. As the afternoon sun began to shift the shadows around the mesquite tree, Joseph felt a growing sense of purpose and urgency. The morning's events had created a window of opportunity that might not remain open indefinitely. The spiritual momentum generated by Thomas Mackenzie's sacrificial gift needed to be channeled into concrete actions before it dissipated. We will begin preparations for the ceremony immediately, Joseph announced. Whether or not anyone from the white community chooses to participate, we will honor Thomas Mackenzie's gift and pray for healing between all the people of this desert. And tomorrow morning, I will travel to Tucson to visit him personally. This final announcement created another wave of surprise and discussion. Joseph had not left the reservation for any extended travel in over 10 years, preferring to focus his energy on serving his immediate community. His willingness to make such a journey emphasized the extraordinary nature of the day's events. "Grandfather," Miguel said gently, "are you sure you're strong enough for such a trip? The drive to Tucson is difficult, and hospitals can be overwhelming places." Joseph smiled at his grandson's concern while appreciating the love behind it. "Miguel, I am 85 years old, and I've been preparing my whole life for moments like this one. If I am not strong enough to respond when the spirits present such a clear opportunity for healing, then I have wasted all my years of training and prayer." As the gathering began to disperse, each person carrying specific responsibilities for the evening's ceremony preparations, Joseph remained seated beneath the mesquite tree. The day had begun with mysterious restlessness, and now he understood why. The spirits had been preparing him for the most important spiritual work of his long life, the work of building bridges across the chasms of fear and misunderstanding that had divided his community from their neighbors for far too long. The Tucson General Hospital bustled with the controlled chaos typical of a major medical facility in 1952. Nurses in starched white uniforms moved efficiently between rooms. Doctors consulted in hushed tones over patient charts, and the distinctive smell of disinfectant mixed with the underlying anxiety that permeated places where life and death decisions were made daily. Elena Moreno sat beside Thomas Mackenzie's hospital bed, maintaining a vigil that had begun the previous afternoon. The cardiac unit was unlike anywhere she had ever spent time, filled with equipment she didn't recognize and medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. But her presence there wasn't about understanding modern medicine. It was about ensuring that a man who had shown extraordinary kindness wasn't alone during his recovery. Thomas had regained consciousness around midnight, confused and disoriented by his unfamiliar surroundings. His first coherent words had been to ask Elena why she was there, a question that seemed to genuinely puzzle him. When she reminded him of his gift of antibiotics to Rosa, he had looked genuinely surprised, as if he couldn't quite believe he had done such a thing. "How is your daughter?" Thomas asked, his voice still weak, but showing improvement from the previous evening. "Much better, thanks to your medicine," Elena replied. "Her fever broke last night, and she's already asking when she can come visit you." Thomas seemed to consider this information with the same bewilderment he had shown about his own actions. "I don't understand why you're here, Mrs. Moreno. You don't owe me anything. If anything, I should be thanking you for getting me to medical help." Elena had been thinking about how to answer this question throughout the long night. "Mr. Mackenzie, in my culture, when someone saves a life, it creates a bond that doesn't end when the immediate crisis is over. You saved my daughter's life. That makes you family, in a way." The concept of extended family obligations was foreign to Thomas's experience, but he could hear the sincerity in Elena's voice. More puzzling to him was the complete absence of the resentment he would have expected from someone whose people had been treated as outsiders for generations. Elena's presence seemed motivated by genuine care rather than mere social obligation. "I've never been anyone's family," Thomas said quietly, a statement that revealed more about his loneliness than he probably intended. Before Elena could respond to this unexpectedly vulnerable admission, the sound of unusual activity in the hospital corridor drew their attention. Through the partially open door, they could see hospital staff gathering in small groups, whispering among themselves with expressions of curiosity and mild confusion. Dr. Harrison, Thomas's cardiologist, appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal bewilderment. "Mr. Mackenzie, you have some unusual visitors requesting to see you. They're not family, and they're certainly not typical hospital visitors." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, though Elena suspected she might already know. "There's an elderly Native American man in the lobby who claims to be a spiritual leader from the reservation. He's asking permission to visit you and to perform some kind of healing ceremony. He's accompanied by several other people from his community, including what appears to be their doctor." Elena felt her heart leap with recognition and gratitude. "That would be my grandfather, Joseph Moreno. He's our spiritual elder." Dr. Harrison looked from Elena to Thomas with growing understanding of the complex situation. "Mrs. Moreno, I understand you've been here since yesterday afternoon. Are you related to Mr. Mackenzie?" "Not by blood," Elena replied carefully, "but he saved my daughter's life yesterday. We consider that a sacred bond." Thomas listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The idea that his simple act of giving medicine to a sick child had somehow created obligations and connections that extended far beyond his understanding was both overwhelming and oddly comforting. For the first time in decades, he was experiencing what it felt like to be part of something larger than his isolated existence. "Dr. Harrison," Thomas said slowly, "I think I would like to meet this spiritual leader. If he took the trouble to come all the way to Tucson, the least I can do is listen to what he has to say." 20 minutes later, Joseph Moreno entered the cardiac unit with a quiet dignity that characterized all his movements. Despite his 85 years, he walked without assistance and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Behind him came Dr. Martinez, Miguel, Maria Santos, and 3 other community elders whose presence indicated the importance of this visit. The hospital staff watched with fascination as this unusual delegation made its way through corridors designed for medical efficiency rather than ceremonial significance. Many had never seen Native Americans in traditional dress within the hospital walls, and the respectful solemnity of the group created an atmosphere unlike anything in their professional experience. Joseph approached Thomas's bedside with careful attention to both medical protocols and cultural sensitivity. He understood that he was entering foreign territory in multiple ways: the modern medical environment and the personal space of someone from outside his community. Mr. Mackenzie, Joseph began in accented but clear English. I am Joseph Moreno, spiritual elder for the Tejano Awadam people. I have come to thank you for the gift you gave to my great-granddaughter and to offer our prayers for your healing. Thomas struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, instinctively recognizing the formality and importance of this encounter. Mr. Moreno, I appreciate you coming, but I honestly don't think what I did yesterday was anything special. Your great-granddaughter was sick, and I had medicine she needed. It seemed like the right thing to do. Joseph exchanged a meaningful glance with the other elders present. Thomas's modest dismissal of his own actions only confirmed their assessment of his character and the spiritual significance of his gesture. Mr. Mackenzie, may I sit with you for a few minutes? There are things I would like to share with you about what your gift has meant to our people. Thomas nodded, and Joseph settled into the chair beside the bed with the careful movements of someone who had learned to respect his body's limitations while never allowing them to define his capabilities. The other visitors arranged themselves around the room in a loose circle, creating an intimate space within the clinical environment. In our tradition, Joseph began, we believe that certain actions create sacred connections between people, even when those people come from different worlds. Your choice to give life-saving medicine to Rosa, especially when you were facing your own mortality, has created such a connection. Thomas listened intently, though much of what Joseph was saying existed outside his normal frame of reference. I'm not really a religious man, Mr. Moreno. I'm not sure I understand about sacred connections. Understanding is not always necessary, Joseph replied gently. Sometimes the heart knows things that the mind cannot yet accept. Your heart knew yesterday that Rosa's need was greater than your own. That knowledge came from a place deeper than religious belief or cultural training. Dr. Harrison, who had remained in the room to monitor his patient's condition, found himself drawn into the conversation despite his initial skepticism about the medical value of spiritual ceremonies. The elderly Native American man spoke with a combination of wisdom and pragmatism that was impressive regardless of one's religious beliefs. Mr. Moreno, Dr. Harrison interjected respectfully. As Mr. Mackenzie's physician, I'm curious about your healing traditions. Do you believe they can complement modern medical treatment? Joseph turned his attention to the doctor with appreciation for the serious question. Dr. Harrison, I believe that healing involves more than just the body. When someone's spirit is troubled or disconnected, physical healing becomes more difficult. Mr. Mackenzie's generous action has created spiritual healing for our community, but it may also have created spiritual questions for him that need attention. This observation seemed to resonate with Thomas more than he expected. Since regaining consciousness, he had been struggling with confusion about his own motivations and the implications of what he had done. For 73 years, he had lived according to certain assumptions about himself and his relationships with others. Yesterday's events had challenged those assumptions in ways that left him feeling unmoored. What kind of spiritual questions? Thomas asked, his curiosity overcoming his habitual skepticism. Questions about who you really are beneath the loneliness and fear that have isolated you for so many years, Joseph replied with gentle directness. Questions about what kind of connections are possible between people who have been taught to see each other as strangers or enemies. Elena watched this exchange with growing emotion, recognizing that something profound was happening between her grandfather and the man who had saved Rosa's life. The cultural and generational barriers that might have prevented such a conversation were dissolving in the face of shared humanity and mutual respect. Mr. Moreno, Thomas said slowly, I've lived alone for a long time. I'm not sure I know how to be connected to other people anymore, even if I wanted to be. Connection is like a muscle, Joseph replied. It can be strengthened with use, even after long periods of neglect. Your gift to Rosa was the beginning of exercising that muscle. What you do next would determine how strong it becomes. Dr. Martinez, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward with a practical suggestion. Elder Moreno, would you be willing to perform your healing ceremony here in hospital? I think it might be beneficial for Mr. Mackenzie to experience our traditions, and it could be educational for the medical staff as well. Dr. Harrison looked uncertain about this proposal, clearly weighing his medical responsibilities against his curiosity about cross-cultural healing approaches. What would such a ceremony involve? I need to ensure that nothing interferes with Mr. Mackenzie's medical treatment. Joseph smiled, understanding the doctor's concerns. Our ceremony would involve prayers, songs, and the burning of sage for purification. Nothing that would conflict with medical treatment, and everything that might support the healing process by addressing spiritual needs alongside physical ones. Thomas found himself surprisingly interested in this possibility, though he couldn't fully explain why. Would I need to do anything specific, or just allow it to happen? Just be open to the experience, Joseph replied. Our prayers are not asking you to change your beliefs or adopt our ways. We are simply asking the spirits to support your healing and to bless the connections that have been created between our peoples. As discussions continued about the logistics of conducting a traditional ceremony within a modern hospital setting, word of the unusual gathering had spread throughout the medical facility. Nurses, orderlies, and other doctors found reasons to pass by the cardiac unit, curious about the respectful but unprecedented cultural exchange taking place. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the hospital's chief administrator, eventually arrived to assess the situation for herself. She found a group of people engaged in thoughtful conversation about healing, spirituality, and cultural understanding, topics that were rarely addressed directly within medical institutions despite their obvious relevance to patient care. Dr. Harrison, she said quietly, is this gathering beneficial for your patient's recovery? Thomas answered before his doctor could respond. Dr. Coleman, I've been alone most of my life, and yesterday I discovered that helping someone else felt better than anything I've done in years. These people are trying to help me understand what that means, and I think I need to learn. Dr. Coleman looked around the room at the diverse group of people who had somehow created an atmosphere of healing that transcended the usual boundaries of medical care. Very well. If you can conduct your ceremony without disrupting other patients or interfering with medical procedures, you have the hospital's permission. Joseph stood and bowed slightly to acknowledge the administrator's cooperation. We are grateful for your understanding. Tonight, we will pray for healing, not just for Mr. Mackenzie, but for all the barriers that prevent people from seeing the goodness in each other. As preparations began for the evening ceremony, Thomas realized that his life was changing in ways he never could have imagined when he woke up with chest pain the previous morning. The isolated rancher who had lived by the principles of self-reliance and cultural separation was discovering possibilities for connection and community that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and his world. Elena squeezed his hand gently. Mr. Mackenzie, you gave Rosa more than medicine yesterday. You gave all of us hope that our communities can learn to see each other differently. Thomas squeezed back, understanding for the first time in decades what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own fears and limitations. Tonight's ceremony would mark not just his physical healing, but the beginning of a spiritual journey that would transform not only his life, but the relationship between two communities that had lived as strangers for far too long.